Hi everyone, my name's Richard Clark. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the CTO of a company called Provar Testing. We've got a testing tool and you can come over to the expo and find out more about it today, or after this session I'll be showing it in the demo jam. Today what I want to talk to you about was more about SalesforceDX. I'm not going to go in depth on SalesforceDX, there's a couple of great talks this afternoon on that. So I'm going to talk about it in the sense of continuous integration, continuous delivery, and the continuous testing side of things. So how many of you are already using SalesforceDX as your deployment tools? Okay. How many of you still use change sets? Don't be embarrassed, it's okay. Yeah, so a few more. How many using metadata API or a third-party product, Gearset, Capado? Okay, which you might be using DX on those. Good. So traditionally, I think we've all been in the background where back in the day when I started Salesforce about 12 years ago, we were having a dev sandbox, we did our changes in that. Maybe we had one, we were progressive and we had one dev sandbox each, we could afford to do that. Before the days we had 10 dev sandboxes. And then you'd try and push all your changes in together and you'd find out you'd overwritten each other. Okay. SalesforceDX is going back and looking at things in a more modern way, or the way everyone else has been doing it the last 20 years, and it's source driven. So we're pushing things into a source control system, whether that's an admin change or a developer change. So it's all one set of changes. So this streamlines the whole entire application lifecycle, because if we work in very small atomic changes, we can have great collaboration across the team, a larger team scaling to deliver things. And what we can also do is break our application up into multiple modules or packages. And that's not if you're an ISV, also if you're an end customer, and I'm going to talk about that. So overall, it improves that collaboration, but it only works if you've then got a continuous improvement program, or sorry, continuous integration program, continuous delivery, and continuous testing. If you want to be agile, if you think you're agile, if you think you're running DevOps, and you're not doing all of those things, then you're neither agile or using DevOps. So some definitions, some things I'm going to refer to today. CLI, hopefully you all know that means the command line interface. Version control system, primarily I'll be talking about Git because that's what I use. I'm sure people still use things like Subversion and things like TFS as well. And when I talk about packages today, I'm talking about SalesforceDX packages, so second generation packaging. I'm not talking about unmanaged and managed packages and all their problems. I'm just talking about the new way of doing things. I'll also be using the word alias. All I mean by that is in SalesforceDX, we can give a org an alias. And why that's good is that instead of having to know the org's username when I'm writing a deployment script, I can refer to it by the alias. I can call it SIT or I can call it UAT. I don't have to worry about where that's really pointing. So I'll be talking about that. For those that aren't familiar, Scratch org, in SalesforceDX you can effectively spin up a brand fresh org and you create a Scratch org for every change you're doing. So say you're working on a Jira issue, you've got a user story to develop, you've got a change you're making. As part of that, you'd create your branch in your Git repository. You'd be using the Scratch org you spin up against that one change. So Scratch orgs are very short-lived, okay? They can live for 1 day, they can live for 30 days. The Scratch org no longer matters because your source code is on your disk or it's in your Git repo, okay? There's no more fear about someone overwriting your change in that org. I'll also be talking about snapshots briefly. So snapshots is a new feature that's coming out. So at the moment when you create a Scratch org, you give it a config file. And that config file will say certain attributes about that org. And that's a growing list of things you can define. So things, is it multi-currency? Is person accounts enabled? Things like that. What most people want, what most end customers want, is to create a Scratch org that looks like their production org with all the right settings, so they don't have to keep defining that in the config.json. So snapshots and shapes, it's also called, is coming, I believe, maybe this year. We'll find out, maybe summer, maybe winter. And one of the main things I'll show today is pipelines. So pipelines is a way of scripting your CI and your CD process, which I didn't write a definition for. So it's a mechanism to script that delivery lifecycle and say, when this change happens, automatically do these steps, run our unit tests, run our code scanning tools, run Provar, hopefully. So some of the main features of SalesforceDX, the concept of disposable Scratch orgs. So Scratch org's no longer the master. Okay. The other key change is that the metadata is much more granular. If you've worked with any large enterprises, I've worked with some that had, the 700 fields on the case object, 87 record types. And where does that all go in metadata API? It goes in the case object. You get megabytes, multiple megabytes, tens of megabytes case objects you're trying to pull down and you're trying to deploy. You pull that down, you make your changes, push it back. you're potentially overwriting a massive amount of change. So with SalesforceDX, we've got a much finer grained metadata where the thing you're deploying is just the thing you've changed. As I've said already, it's source driven, not org driven. And with the CLI, yes, there's a command line. And if you're an admin, you might think, oh, I don't like command lines. But if you're using Visual Studio Code with the plugins in it, you can actually type English in. I'm going to SFDX create org, and it fills it in for you, and it asks you for the parameters. So the autocomplete's really, really good. So if you looked at SalesforceDX last year when it first came out and thought, I don't do command line, have a look again, go on Trailhead, do the modules about learning SalesforceDX, and it will take you through the setup of Visual Studio. CLI is also an open platform. You can write your own plugins for it. And I'm going to talk about that as well today. So that's the first time today I'm going to demo something called ProVar.dx, where we can actually have our own plugin that makes ProVar run tests as part of the SFDX commands. And if you're looking to package your application, and that is whether you're an internal customer, an end user, and you realize you've got a HR module, a sales and a service module, and you want to break that down, we can use packaging for that. And if you're an ISV, we can use packaging but not yet put it in the production org. So we can create our package, we can test them, but at the moment you can't deploy that to customers. But at some point, maybe winter 20, maybe spring 20, who knows. So some of the other key concepts with SalesforceDX, you have a dev hub. And that dev hub is your directory of all the different orgs you create. Because instead of having like SIT, UAT, stage, systest, you'll have a multitude of scratch orgs. And they might be named based on the feature that you're doing. It might be based on the change. But what you're not generally doing, you're not sharing that scratch org. You should just be you working on that one scratch org for your changes. The other thing you can do with Dev Hub that came out after SalesforceDX first came out, you can attach your sandboxes. So your Dev Hub should have your scratch orgs fine, but you should also be attaching in that, connecting up your SIT sandbox, your full sandbox, your pre-production, all of those environments as well. And you can use SalesforceDX to move your packages or your changes into those orgs as well. And you can also deploy and retrieve metadata from those orgs with a single command. And typically your dev hub is your production org if you're an end customer. If you're an SI or an ISV, you'll have a partner org you use. But if you're developing and you think you can use a developer edition for your dev hub, do not do that. Okay, I'll talk more about that next, about limits. What we've now got is the Salesforce CLI. So I've talked about how that's extendable. There's a public API for it, which is still beta. I've been assured that that public API is beta because they're going to add more to it, not because of what they're going to change what's in there. So if you are writing a custom plugin, there is a slight risk that you're working against the beta API, but I think it's worth the risk. Because Salesforce CLI is integrated with your VCS, you're not having to do your own Git commands, you're not having to learn Git, you sort of do it as you use SalesforceDX. And there's more information on SalesforceDX this afternoon, so Jai's got a talk where he goes more into that, going from change sets to SalesforceDX. Okay, I talked about the autocomplete as well. So packaging is different with SalesforceDX. Whatever you thought you knew about packaging before, all the negatives, forget about them, it's changed. An unlocked package is where you're deploying code, changes, metadata, without any protection. So you're pushing it into an org as you would with an unmanaged package. Now what's changed is whether you're doing an unlocked or a managed package, so one where you've maybe hidden the Apex code or any IP that you have. We have namespaces for both. So that means we can protect our changes and isolate the changes that this is in the HR package and this is in the service package. We've also got versioning on both, and they're upgradable and downgradable on both. So that's quite revolutionary. So that whole put a change in, what did you do, fix and go forward. There's no rollback strategy. That didn't go down well with financial services. Okay, you don't have to create your own destroy XML. It's fantastic. What you can also have is packages can be dependent on one another. So if you are thinking about breaking up your application into a number of packages, you'll probably find you'll start with something called a core package, where you've maybe got all your data objects, all your S objects, all your definitions there, the things that everything shares, and that's like the thing that everything's based on. And then your other packages can live off that, and each one could be versioned independently. That lets you control that regression risk. The other thing we've got is a single source. So for each of those packages, we've got our source code, we've got the versions, we've got our Git history, all integrated into one against those versions, against those package versions. So I said earlier about scratch org limits. So the reason you don't use a dev org, a dev edition org, it's because you don't get enough scratch orgs. So 3 is not going to be enough, okay? Certainly for any commercial development. You need at least an enterprise edition. I'm fairly sure you can buy extra scratch orgs if you want. If that bit.ly link at the top will just take you to this page so you can track any changes or updates. For me, 40 is okay for a small project, okay? But if you've got a large project, you want to be thinking about either buying extra scratch orgs or using an unlimited edition if you're lucky enough to have it. So, continuous integration. So continuous integration is where we react to something being changed and we're going to test it immediately or we're going to validate it immediately. So as part of your continuous integration, you'd be thinking about automated testing to validate those changes. And I'm not talking about Provar here, I'm generally talking about unit tests for a start. Typically that will be source-driven triggered. So it might be you've got a pull request or a merge request, depending what your process is, when do you want to check that? So what you might say is every time someone does a pull request, I'm going to run my CI process. I'm going to check with my source code scanner. So if you're using Clayton or anything like that, or Code Scan, I'm going to run all the unit tests. And when the person reviews that PR, they can have all that evidence in front of them. They know what's actually already passed or failed rather than having to merge it to it. Or you could say when we merge the code, at that point, I'm going to take the changes, push it into another scratch org, and validate everyone's changes at once. Okay, so the other thing you can do, so we do see customers using Provar to do testing at that stage. We never expected developers to use Provar. We designed it for QA people, but developers are now starting to use it as well in some companies. And what they do is a limited set of UI API tests. So they've got their Lightning tests, they've got their Jest if they're using web components now, and they've got maybe their normal Apex code unit tests as well. But they use Provar to check the end-to-end transaction, because they may have a piece of Apex, they might have a Lightning flow, they might have a workflow, and they want to check the whole transaction works as the business expects. So continuous delivery is where you've made your changes, you've validated them, you want to bring them together and push them onto your traditional sandboxes. So again, what we can do is either to automatically deploy that every time we've passed our CI checks, or we can trigger that based on someone pressing a button. So it could be manually initiated, or it might be a nightly build. So every night we take what's been committed, validated, and push that into our production org. I don't imagine many people are doing that. But we can push it maybe into UAT. Whether you run unit tests automatically or not, you need to think about for yourself. So you have to think about when you run unit tests, what's the scope of that unit test? If you've got lots of third-party packages, if they fail their unit test, do you want your deployment to pass or do you want it to fail? You need to consider that. It's a different decision for different people. I can't tell you it's a right or wrong answer. But when we do continuous delivery, at that point, you want a more comprehensive set of regression or smoke tests. So you want to be sure that everything that you had before is working, as well as those changes you've just made. So I've tested my new stuff in CI, but you don't tend to often test much of the existing regression. I want to talk a bit about packaging. So I've talked about improving parallel development by containerizing things. You've got those version history in packaging. So you've got package, you've got package versions, you've got each one independently, and you've got this easier rollback. Because you link your dev hub with your sandboxes as well as your scratch orgs, you're using the same tooling for both. So you haven't got to worry about, if I'm developing, I use SalesforceDX, and when I go to production, I have to use this. It's the same tool. And if you've got an existing sandbox strategy, you can keep that. So you just link that up, and you go through the same stages that you do today. As I've already said, unlocked packages are fantastic if you're an end customer or if you're an SI. It's a great way to build out an application, make it more modular, put the dependencies in, and reduce your regression risk. So if I change my core package, pretty much everything has to be retested. But if I change my sales package, I don't have to retest core because it can't be impacted by it. They're separate. Second generation managed packages for ISVs is not yet GA. I know there's some people on the pilot, I believe. But I don't think you can put them in the production org yet. So I think you can put them in a dev edition, so you can test out deployments, but you can't go to production. One of the reasons for that, if you think about Salesforce ecosystem, how many partners there are, everyone that's currently got a managed package, first generation, wants a migration path to go to second generation packaging. I guess that's taken a lot more time. If we think about SalesforceDX has an application lifecycle. So what's changed is instead of a org being in the center of this, maybe it's your production, maybe it's your dev sandbox, we now have a version control system such as Git. So we've got our typical tasks: plan, code, build, test, and release. And outside of that, we've got the tools around that. So if you think you're doing a application lifecycle in the center there, and you don't have tools to cover all this, you should be considering what you're going to do about that, or if you don't know what those tools are. So you may be using an editor such as Visual Studio Code, you may be using Force.com IDE, you may be using Illuminated Cloud. All of those work with SalesforceDX, and I'm sure there's many more as well. So that's your coding phase sorted. Using Scratch orgs for your devs, spinning those up. So each one's unique, each one's got their own copy, not affected by each other's changes. In the build, we're using that continuous integration. We can use Provar or Selenium test scripts or your own test automation. It may not be automated, but I recommend it. And then when we go to our testing phase, we do use tools like Provar typically, or you do use your Selenium scripts for that full validation of your delivery. You've got your sandboxes for staging those releases, do UAT. And obviously, we've got packaging as an option if you want to push things into production in an easy rollback way. Just one more word on unlocked packages. If someone has an unlocked package and you push that into production org and the admin changes it in production and they don't change the package, next time that package is deployed, that change will be lost, okay? Which is a good thing. So if we think about CI and CD end-to-end, just really what I've explained here, we've got our Scratch orgs being used by developers here. I'm using the SFDX force source push and pull here to synchronize with my Git repository. When I'm happy with my changes, they're integrated into my CI platform. In this case, we're building a package, and then we're going to install that package into another Scratch org, and that's spun up on the fly, and I'm going to demo that today. Once you're happy that package can be pushed in, so whatever decision making you need to do to move over to the CD on the right-hand side, again, you're using maybe if you're lucky enough to have one of the new Lightning sandboxes, again, you can create that on the fly, or use a Dev Pro sandbox, and so on and so forth, partial sandbox, full sandbox, all the way through to production. So the reason we do continuous delivery is because we want to mitigate those risks. We want to increase confidence in the builds we're doing, provide people evidence that it's working. That is really giving you communication with your stakeholders and confidence in what you're doing. And if you can do it automated, you're reducing the overhead for that. So overall, we're ensuring consistency, and you just sort of get those circular benefits. If we consider a standard DevOps infinity curve here, strip, I've obviously highlighted continuous testing. Of course, I'm going to do that. But each one of these steps is important, okay? Most Salesforce customers are doing some of these steps. Not many are doing all of them, which is interesting. So continuous testing is a process of executing those tests as part of that pipeline I talked about. So it's part of that DevOps cycle. It's an important link, the same as the others. And if you want to be agile, if you want to use DevOps, then you need to be thinking about doing that. So your other option from test automation is manual testing. And now if you're doing manual testing, you can have an army of testers offshore somewhere, very cheap resources, often very good at what they do, but you've got variability in their test coverage. Do they always get through all the test scripts in time? Are they testing in sprint? Are they testing sprint +1? Or is they only test at the end of your release? Typically the latter. So you can't be agile with manual testing. And you're also not catching defects early enough. If you can automate your testing, then you're going to catch them maybe when someone does that CI process. So you can know sooner rather than later that you've gone and broken your case handling, which would affect 2,000 service agents. You want to know about that and fix it, not at 2 a.m. in the morning. So here's my Provar product pitch. Apologies. One of the benefits of doing a talk. So we do UI and API testing. And we actually do end-to-end testing. So that allows us to make S-object calls into an org, to populate data, to drive the UI and capture results. But we can also inspect things like where an email's been sent out. Was the format of that email correct? Were the right attachments on that email? Was it addressed to the right recipients? We can also hook into, say, web services. So is that transaction, when that opportunity closed won, is there an order in SAP? Yes or no? I can hook into a database either to drive my tests with test data or to save test results. Or again, if your database is part of your end-to-end integration solution, I can validate that as well. The other important thing about Provar is it's declarative. So it's a drag and drop user interface. So the majority of your tests you write is point and click, which allows your manual testers to be doing test automation. You don't have to pay someone £60,000 a year as a developer to write tests instead of a developer writing code So for me, it always doesn't make sense to write code and employ a developer to do that, to test something. So brief look at Provar. This is pretty much all I'm going to show of it today. On the left-hand side is our test builder, just a video of it sort of stepping through the steps. And what we do is generate all the navigation for you. So you map the interactions the user does. You don't have to map that, press this tab or navigate to this sub-tab. On the right-hand side is some test report results. So we can push our results into anything. I can raise a Jira ticket if I want to on a failure. I can integrate with ALM. I can pull my test plans in from Cucumber if I wanted. But I can also push my test results into something like a Salesforce package here with a couple of custom objects where I've got each test run and I've got a dashboard showing my progress and coverage, which tells me two things. It tells me which parts of my application, is it the sales module, is it the case screen, is the most brittle. And it tells me which of my test cases are failing most often. So maybe I need to revise my test cases so they're more robust, or maybe I need to look at why we keep failing in the same area. Is there a coding issue here? Is there a problem with changes in that team? So now I'm just going to do a live demonstration. I'm going to show you a Jenkins pipeline using SalesforceDX with Provar integrated. So fingers crossed, demo gods and all that. Let me just refresh this. That's okay. So I'm just going to hit a build now. So I'm not going to trigger this from a change, but I've already made a change. So I press build. We'll see this hopefully detect changes. One commit. So it's just seeing that I made a change. It's now going through its SalesforceDX commands. So it's authenticating on the Dev Hub. Now, normally when you use a Dev Hub, it's going to pop open a window and it's going to ask for your username, password, okay, to make sure you can integrate that Dev Hub. That Dev Hub lets you log into any of those other orgs by just saying open. No more usernames, passwords to remember. It's fantastic. To do it with a script, what we use is obviously JWT bearer token. And so we do it under covers with a shared secret and client certificate, consumer key. So we created a Scratch org. That's happened on the fly. This is real. It's not vaporware. This is just standard stuff that's all on Trailhead. Dave Carroll's documented how to do this pipeline in Jenkins. We've then allocated a password for that. What we could also do is create other users in that org with different profiles, and we assign them different permission sets as well. So again, if we want to test different user experiences, we can do that. That's now getting pushed, the changes for the Dreamhouse application in this case, into that org, and it's going to run unit tests, and it's going to load test data. While that's still running, I'm going to flip back to the slides. I'll give it a few more seconds. So really, these are the commands that we're running. We're doing the checkout, simple command. We're doing the Dev Hub authentication, simple command. Obviously, I've left off all the long string of flags and parameters. I'm creating a Scratch org, and I've given that Scratch org an alias of LC19. So every time I run this, all my scripts use LC19. I don't care what the name of that test at blah, 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 at example.com is. It doesn't matter. We generate the passwords. Provar needs a password, but we don't expose that to the user. We pass that as a parameter. We're pushing that deployment, force source push, into that Scratch org. We're assigning any permission sets we need. In this case, it's the Dreamhouse application. We're running our unit tests. Mustn't forget our unit tests are quite important still. And if any one of these steps fail, the pipeline will fail. It won't go to the next step. We don't waste time. We load some test data using SFDX, but we could equally do it with our own Provar tool as well. And we then run our Provar tests as well, and we get some evidence out the end. So again, when I run that test, I'm doing it against LC19. Now, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, that would have said ANT, okay? What we've changed is we've developed a custom plugin for SalesforceDX, SFDX space Provar, with our own namespace. So this isn't GA yet. We're going to be launching it at Trailhead DX, but it is running on here today. Let's just flip back. I'm hoping that's finished by now. So we're at the point now it's running Provar's test cases. So it's doing that last command that I showed you. Hopefully it's going to take 50 odd seconds. One of the things about SalesforceDX, it's finished. Yay. Timings are not guaranteed. Performance can vary tremendously. So this deployment took 1 minute 30. Previously it took 33 seconds. So you do get a lot of variability around that, okay? Maybe it's a network connection today. Maybe it's just the platform has variable scalability. So we've got our test results. So let's look at those test results in a second. So I can look at those test results within here if I wanted. So I've got a JUnit. I can look at a HTML file off them, or I can look at a PDF version of those results. Okay, so writing our own custom plugin was interesting. So what we did, like any developer, we just went straight in and started writing TypeScript and other things. So we took an approach where the first thing we did is we already had some Java classes we run for Provar. And what my goal was to just replace using Ant. So if you move to SalesforceDX and you had metadata API, customers saying to us, why do I still have to install Ant? I don't want Ant on any of my machines now. It's dead. I don't want to use it. And that made me scratch my head and think about how we could do this. And I went to a talk at Dreamforce on writing custom plugins, which was incredibly useful. Writing a custom plugin, if you follow it on Trailhead or on the developer force, is incredibly easy to write a simple hello world one, okay? And it's surprising how easy it is. I'll talk about some of the lessons learned and some of the challenges. A lot of plugins have been published on NPM, so there's about 70 plugins so far people have shared. And some of them are as simple as taking those multiple commands, those 8 commands, and saying, I just want to run one command. I do want to use command line, but I don't want to type that every time. So I just write one command that does 8 commands. Really, really easy to do with SalesforceDX. It's also very powerful. In our case, we had a Java application that runs with some parameters. So we were able to just leverage that Java application that Ant was calling and just do it via SalesforceDX instead. Now, what I didn't do is write documentation first, okay? I'm still a developer partly at heart. I thought I'll do that at the end. So what happened was every command I added, every flag, the command line got longer and longer and longer until I went, I need a property file. So we went back to the property file, and then we had this conflict between what was a flag and what was a property. So write your documentation first, make your flags consistent with what Salesforce use. So if they say target username, don't call your username, use the target username. Weirdly, you have to implement short and long time, so -u or -- target username. But it does, by writing your documentation first and looking at that, one, it's all done for the end of the project. It gives your system testers something to validate against, so they can check it's working. And we can review that with people. So I've got Dave Carroll now, I'm asking him to review my documentation before we write and finish our plugin. And ultimately, you'll reach a point where you think, rather than get people to pass all these parameters and make it hard for them, if they give them a nice JSON property file, like config.json, when you spin up a Scratch org, that's probably more acceptable to most people. And then maybe can override some values. You've got a couple of choices when writing up a custom plugin. You can use the Salesforce CLI to extend SalesforceDX, which means your command will start SFDX, like mine. Or you can use Oakcliff, what Salesforce CLI is written in, to write your own CLI. So you could call something called MyDX. Now, we went for the Salesforce CLI because I want what's in the Dev Hub. I want all those user connections. I want the ability to create Scratch orgs, to create users, to assign permission sets. So that worked for us. But for your use case, you might find, rather than start with Salesforce CLI, if there's nothing you're using in that, none of the commands, none of the API, then you look at using Oakcliff if you want to write your own CLI. Some of the challenges we had was when it comes to setting up SalesforceDX on corporate PCs, and certainly if you're writing a custom plugin, you'll find some issues where you start hacking admin rights, okay, to install things. So if it's a corporate lockdown machine, you could struggle. So personal laptops are great for this. The core CLI library is beta, but as I said earlier, that's not really a problem because nothing you're using should change. And currently there's no security review for third-party plugins. Okay, so if you use someone else's plugin, if you use our plugin, it's not been through a security review. There's no app exchange for it yet. There's no ISV program to support people that want to write custom plugins yet. And if you write one and you think, well, I'll open source it, which is what we're going to do, and you think people are going to come on, they're going to collaborate and give you all these great features, you can get this army of developers around the world, there's probably less than 200 people that are collaborating so far on those custom plugins. So hopefully this year, more people will get involved, add more to the pool, and so we'll see more changes come through. So here's your photo moment. So if you want to know more about anything that I've talked about today, the top 4 in green, hopefully it's come out, standard Salesforce documentation. So those bit.ly links on the right-hand side will take you to the Trailhead module, the video, the developer user guide for it. And the bottom 2 are specifically about Provar, about the integration or the test results package. If you want to know more about SalesforceDX, there's 2 more talks this afternoon that I recommend. So Mick's doing one on CI with SalesforceDX, GitHub, and Circle CI. So like I've done Jenkins, he's doing it with Circle CI instead. So that's almost certainly worth going to. And Jai's doing one on source-driven configuration. He's talking about if you use change sets today, how do you then switch to using SalesforceDX? So again, if you're in that change sets pool, that's a good talk to go to see how you go on that journey and how you move over and how you convince people it's worth the effort to change what we do today. Thank you very much. If you want to speak to me, I'll be at the Provar stand, and we're going to be at the demo jam after this session. We've got some time for questions. So we're over in the far left corner as you come down the stairs. Questions? I'm not going to answer questions. If you've got a question and you don't want to say it out publicly, I can't answer it after this session, okay? You can't come up to me and see me because I've got to run up to the demo jam. So you can come over to see me on the expo after 1 o'clock, or we can just catch you later on, get business card, etc. Any questions? So when it comes to unlock packages, do everything in core, we're going to core and extension packages, or is there another way? So from what I've seen, if you do it right, and you write your application from scratch using things like dependency injection, okay, there's a great talk by Andy Fawcett from that, look it up on Dreamforce, I think it was, then you can do it. But if you've got an existing application and you're trying to reverse engineer it, you're going to struggle to do it. So I think if it's greenfield, you can do it. But I think the level of effort needed to reverse engineer something you've already built is going to be a problem for unlocked packages. Apparently I've got 10 minutes to go yet.
I've been previously advised that introducing test automation shouldn't be done for release 1 because the platform isn't stable.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree to that, or is it actually
I
already introduce it for release 1?
So test automation, should we do it in release 1 or should we wait till after release 1? I used to always say to people, wait till after release 1. And then you see that people have this issue where the amount of regression tests they have to do is far more than release 2. So I would start your test automation in release 1, but it only works if your application is delivered in modules that you can say that point is a point where we can now say it's stable. So it's not about release 1, it's about where your code base is stable. And then if you use the right tool, so if you're using a coded framework, I'd say wait until after release 1. If you're using a declarative tool like Provar, you can actually do it in sprint. You can actually make your changes, run them at the end of the sprint, and you're building up that regression test. When you have to go and edit them, it's not that hard to go back and change that, to remove that, to add an extra field. Any other questions? So the question is, do we see a lot of demand for test automation? A lot of people say manual testing use. That's exactly why we exist. So our growth as a company has been around 6 years. Since SalesforceDX came out, we've been on a hockey stick growth, so we've been doubling each year since then. So the awareness is now there that previously people thought, well, there's no point fixing test automation because I've got all these other problems I'm trying to solve. So that's definitely shifted. The other thing is by using a tool that's declarative, all those manual testers no longer have to worry about their job security. Okay, they do more meaningful testing, they can do exploratory testing, and they can use a tool to do it. So whereas a previous skill set of people, maybe a different skill set to those that were automation test engineers, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars in the US, amazing guys, those people are also using things like Provar, because actually they'll still do their hard stuff. There are still things that they have to do in that way. They still have to write XPaths, they still have to know about Selenium, custom page objects, they still get to do those tasks, but the boring stuff is done for them. So we've definitely seen a huge rise in that, mainly in the enterprise space, but also in the ISV space as well. Any more? It's your only chance. 5 minutes. Ah. Yeah. So there's a lot of CI tools out. There's the question, how do we choose which one we use? So obviously, we've been clever in working with all of them. So whether you use Jenkins, Circle CI, Copado, Gearset, AutoRabbit, all those guys as well, or you do it yourself, we can work with all of those. what you have to think about is what is it you're trying to achieve. So Circle CI is great at CI. It's not great at CD. Azure DevOps is actually a really strong platform for this because it's got all your ticketing in it. It's actually one tool that has. So if you're a Microsoft partner and you're big into Microsoft, Azure DevOps is probably the way to go. So you've got an engine in there, you've got Git or TFS in there, you've got the way to do pipelines is all part of it, JUnit results captured, test plans. It's a massive end-to-end tool. So as far as I know, Azure DevOps is the only one that really has that breadth if you want every single piece. But otherwise, look at what other tools you're using in your company. So there's no point using a different tool for Salesforce that you use for your Java development or your Microsoft development. All of them can do the things you want. The other thing to think about is the future and where you're going to run your CI, how scalable it needs to be. Do you need to do parallel tests? Do you need to do parallel builds? What's the security you have to put in place? So it is a vendor selection process at the moment, but I'd normally start with what do we have today? Can I use that? No. Okay, what are the gaps that I have to find another tool? Any more?
How will you deal with customer making changes straight on production? I mean, validation rules, stuff like that.
So that happens a lot. And so one of the things I often experience when I was doing deployment at 2 a.m. is that someone's added a validation rule that day since we last validated our package or our deployment. So how do you test against that? So you can run your sort of smoke tests. So you could do some API tests in something like Provars. You could run that consistently. So you could actually have that scheduled on an hourly basis. We run a certain set of smoke tests. You can have those tear down as long as you're not worried about auto increment IDs going up. So an invoice ID, it might be a problem for an invoice number. But if you're not worried about that, you can actually detect that and do it in real time and just flag that and say, whoa, someone's just changed something in production. The other thing you can do is use tools such as Capado and Gearset, which will actually do org monitoring, and they will flag and say, whoa, that's happened. So you can actually get a warning through those tools as well if you want. Any more, or are we done? Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you in the demo jam. Please vote for Provar. Thank you.
Capado separates user stories into individual feature branches in your code repository. This makes it easy to deploy code into multiple environments without having to worry about other developers' changes being introduced accidentally. Capado also automates the process of doing a pull request, making it easy to compare code from one environment to the other.
Earlier, with chain sets, adding metadata components used to take time. But with Capado, it has become easy and quick because it provides ability to search, filter by type, last modified by, created date, etc. Also, it has ability to integrate with Jira, Git, Bitbucket, making it powerful and providing traceability for our changes.
As a release manager at MassMutual, the great benefits I see are it helps us to bundle multiple user stories across a team and deploy in one go, which saves a lot of release time. But in chain sets, we have to deploy user stories individually. With chain sets, developer can skip an environments while deployment, but with Capado, we have a set deployment flow between the environment. Capado comes with a great reports and dashboard, which helps us to track an org level metadata changes.
When I joined MassMutual approximately a year ago, we had a team size of around 50. Now over the last year, we've increased probably about twofold, and we've gone over 100 people for this team. Bringing in Capado was one of our best decisions. Not only was it a scalable solution with delivery with high confidence, but it also introduces and integrates the QA piece, establishing a CI/CD pipeline that every company really wants in today's day. They have given us professional support. They have given us innovative solutions. They have really worked with us hand in hand closely to make it a success story for us.
What some people may not realize is that MassMutual has been on Salesforce now for many years. As we leaned into our digital transformation, this presented both a challenge and an automation. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity in terms of maturing our release management practice. I'm actually very pleased with both the features and the partnership Capado has offered. We've achieved a number of short-term wins, and I'm now more confident about our future ability to scale our DevOps practices here at MassMutual.